The rain came down so hard that night that it sounded like static on a broken radio. Ethan Cole gripped the wheel with both hands, knuckles white, headlights cutting through a wall of water that refused to part. He was 19. He was late. He was driving too fast on a road he had driven 100 times before, and none of that mattered the moment the truck ahead of him swerved. He remembered the swerve. He remembered the horn. He remembered the world tilting sideways like someone had picked up the whole night and shaken it. Then nothing, then pain, then a voice. A girl's voice, close to his ear, steady in a way nothing else was steady. Hands pressing something warm and firm against his side. A coat, maybe. He never saw her face clearly. Blood loss does that. It blurs the edges of things and keeps only the center, and the center of that night was her hands, and her voice telling him to stay awake, to keep his eyes open, to breathe. Then sirens, then hospital lights, then she was gone. He asked about her for weeks. Nobody at the hospital had a record of a girl matching what little he could describe. No name, no number, no trace, just a debt he could never repay to a stranger he could never find. 11 years later, Ethan Cole sat in a lawyer's office in a suit that fit him too well, listening to a will that fit him too badly. Gareth Finch cleared his throat and read the paragraph again, slower this time, as if slowing down might make the words less absurd. Walter Cole, in his final act as a man who had never once let his grandson make an easy decision, had attached a condition to the inheritance of the family shipping company. Ethan had 6 months to marry. If he did not, controlling shares would pass to his cousin Nolan, a man who had spent the last decade proving he cared more about yachts than cargo manifests. Ethan sat very still. Around him, the office held its breath. "He can't be serious," Ethan said. "He was very serious," Gareth answered. "He had me revise this clause 4 times. He wanted it to be unbreakable." Ethan thought of his grandfather's hands, rough from decades on docks before he ever wore a suit, and understood with a kind of grim clarity that this was exactly the sort of trap the old man would have found funny. He thought about refusing. He thought about walking away and letting Nolan have the company, the ships, the name on the building. He thought about it for exactly 1 night, and then he thought about the 4,000 people whose paychecks came from that company, and about the promise he had made at his grandfather's bedside, and he stopped thinking about refusing. By the end of the week, he had agreed to something he never imagined agreeing to. A marriage arranged the way business deals were arranged, through discretion and paperwork, and people who specialized in exactly this kind of complicated, unromantic solution. That was how he came to sit across a table from Maren Whitfield on a Tuesday afternoon, in a private room at a restaurant that did not put its name outside the door. She did not look like someone auditioning for a marriage. She looked like someone doing him a favor she had already decided not to enjoy. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her clothes were plain but well kept. Her eyes moved over him once carefully, the way a person checks a door to see if it is locked, and then settled somewhere just past his shoulder. "You don't have to pretend to be excited," she said, before he had said anything at all. "I'm not going to pretend either." He almost laughed. It was the most honest sentence anyone had said to him in weeks. "That's fair," he said. They talked for 40 minutes. She asked practical questions. What would be expected of her? Whether there would be public appearances? Whether the arrangement came with an end date or was meant to be permanent? He answered as plainly as she asked, and somewhere in the middle of that plainness, he found himself watching her more closely than the conversation required. There was something in the way she sat, spine straight, shoulders squared, like a person who had learned a long time ago that softness was a thing you saved for when you could afford it. There was something in her voice, too, low and even, that pulled at a memory he could not place. He told himself it was nothing. Strangers reminded you of other strangers all the time. That was simply how memory worked, unreliable and generous with false matches. They met once more before the wedding briefly, to sign paperwork neither of them read as closely as they should have. She wore the same guarded expression. He wore the same practiced calm. Neither of them mentioned that this was, by any reasonable definition, insane. The wedding itself was small and fast, held in a garden behind Gareth Finch's office, because neither of them wanted an audience for something that was, underneath the flowers and the vows, a contract wearing a white dress. Marin stood across from him under an arch neither of them had chosen, holding a bouquet neither of them had picked, and when the officiant asked Ethan to take her hand, he did. The moment their palms touched, something happened that he could not explain and would spend a long time trying not to think about. His grip stuttered. For half a second the garden disappeared. He was 19 again in the rain, with sirens far away and getting closer, and a stranger's hand pressed hard against his side, holding him together when nothing else could. The sensation was so specific, so exact, that his breath caught in his throat. Marin's eyes flicked to his face. Something moved behind them, quick and controlled, gone before he could name it. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly so only he could hear. "Déjà vu," he said, because it was easier than the truth, which was that he had no idea what had just happened to him. She nodded once and said nothing else. The ceremony continued. He signed his name beneath hers on a certificate that made them husband and wife in the eyes of the law and strangers to each other in every way that mattered. Later, in the car that took them from the garden to the house that would now belong to both of them, Ethan glanced at her and found her looking out the window, jaw tight, hands folded in her lap like she was holding something in place. He thought about asking what she was thinking. He decided against it. They had just built a marriage out of legal necessity. It seemed unfair to demand honesty on top of that, especially when he was not sure he wanted to examine his own reaction closely enough to explain it to anyone, least of all himself. What he did not know, could not know, sitting in that car with rain starting to fall softly against the window in a pattern that echoed a storm from 11 years earlier, was that the woman beside him already understood exactly why his hand had stuttered when he touched hers. She had felt his pulse jump the same way once before, under her palm in the dark, on a road neither of them ever spoke about again. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that some truths were safer left folded small and put away, the way you fold a coat you can no longer wear but cannot bring yourself to throw out. The car pulled up to the house. Lights were already on inside, arranged by staff who had never met either of them, and would spend the next several months learning the particular silence that lived between a husband and a wife who had signed a contract instead of falling in love. Ethan stepped out first and offered his hand to help her from the car. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, and if her fingers lingered a half-second longer than necessary, if there was something careful and deliberate in the way she let him pull her upright, he did not notice. He had a company to save, 4 months left on a deadline, and a marriage to figure out how to live inside. He did not know that the woman walking beside him into that house had already saved his life once. He did not know that he was about to spend the next several months trying to figure out why, every time she was near him, some old and buried part of him kept insisting she already had. The house settled into a rhythm within the first 2 weeks, and the rhythm was this: 2 people orbiting the same rooms without ever quite occupying them together. Ethan took breakfast at 6:30, alone, reading reports on his tablet. Marin appeared closer to 7, made her own coffee even though the housekeeper offered every morning to make it for her, and sat at the far end of the table with a book she rarely seemed to be reading. Dinner was the only meal they shared, and even that felt more like a business review than a marriage. Ethan would talk about the company, about shipping routes and quarterly numbers and the slow, grinding effort of proving to the board that he deserved the position his grandfather had left him. Marin would listen, ask sharp, useful questions that suggested she understood more about business than she ever volunteered, and then retreat to her side of the house, the moment the plates were cleared. He told himself this was fine. This was what they had agreed to. Neither of them had promised warmth. They had promised a signature and a public appearance, and eventually an annulment or a divorce once the company was secured and the 6-month clock had run out its purpose. There was no reason to expect more than that, and every reason not to. And yet, he noticed things about her that a man who wanted only a business arrangement would not have bothered to notice. He noticed that she flinched, just slightly, at the sound of tires screeching outside on wet pavement, a sound the city produced often enough that most people had long since stopped hearing it at all. He noticed that she kept her back to the wall in restaurants, that she scanned exits the way people do when they have learned, somewhere in their history, that exits matter. He noticed a gray hooded sweatshirt in the back of her closet one afternoon when he was looking for a jacket he had left in the wrong room. Plain, laundered, folded with a kind of careful precision that suggested it was important to her even though she never wore it. None of it added up to anything specific. All of it added up to the sense that Maren Whitfield was a woman carrying something she had no intention of setting down in front of him. He might have let it stay a curiosity, filed away and mostly ignored, if not for what happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn, 3 weeks into the marriage, when the two of them were caught in the kind of near miss that reveals more about a person than months of dinners ever could. They had been walking back from a charity event, one of the public appearances the arrangement required, when a car ran the red light at the corner ahead of them, tires screaming against wet asphalt exactly the way Ethan had seen make Maren flinch before. This time there was no distance to soften the sound. The car was close, closing fast, aimed at the crosswalk where a group of pedestrians had already stepped off the curb. Ethan froze for a half-second, the way people do when the brain has not yet caught up to what the eyes are seeing. Maren did not freeze. She moved before he understood she was moving, grabbing the arm of an elderly man beside them and hauling him backward onto the curb with a strength that did not match her frame, shouting a warning to the others that cut through the noise of the engine and the rain. The car swerved, clipped a trash bin, and screamed away down the block. The pedestrians stood shaken but unhurt, thanks to a woman who had reacted in under a second to a threat everyone else was still processing. Ethan stared at her. Maren stood very still, breathing hard, her hand still gripping the old man's sleeve. For a moment, something raw and unguarded moved across her face, something that looked less like adrenaline and more like memory. Then it was gone, folded away as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the careful blankness he had grown used to. "Are you all right?" she asked the old man, her voice steady again, as if the last 10 seconds had happened to someone else. The old man thanked her 3 times before his family arrived to collect him, shaken but grateful. Ethan waited until they were alone in the car home before he spoke. "That was fast," he said, "faster than most people react." "I've had practice," she said, looking out the window, the way she often did when a conversation edged too close to somewhere she did not want to go. "Practice at what?" She did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost too quiet to hear over the sound of the wipers. "At paying attention when it counts, that's all." He wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask what had put that look on her face, the one that had nothing to do with strangers on a street corner and everything to do with something much older. But he had learned in 3 weeks of careful cohabitation that Maren Whitfield answered questions the way a locked door answers a knock, politely, firmly, without opening. He let it go that night. He did not let it go entirely. Something had shifted in him after that evening, though he could not have named it if pressed. He started noticing her more, not in the careful, cataloging way he noticed problems to be solved, but in a way that felt less deliberate and more helpless. He noticed the particular sound of her laugh, rare enough that he had only heard it twice, once when the housekeeper's dog knocked over a vase, and once when he had said something dry about his cousin Nolan's taste in boats. He noticed that she was kinder to the staff than she needed to be, remembering names, asking about a sick relative, staying late once to help the cook finish a recipe that had gone wrong. He noticed, too, that his cousin Nolan had not simply accepted the marriage and gone quietly back to his boats. It started small. A supplier who had worked with the company for 15 years suddenly pulled out of a contract, citing reasons that made no sense on paper. A board member who had always supported Ethan began asking pointed questions about his readiness to lead. A journalist who covered the shipping industry ran a piece questioning whether the marriage was, in her words, a convenient fiction designed to satisfy an outdated legal clause. Ethan traced the leaks back far enough to know, without being able to prove it yet, that Nolan was behind at least some of it. His cousin had never accepted losing gracefully, not as a child and certainly not now, with an entire company on the line. He mentioned it to Marin over dinner one night, more out of habit than any expectation that she would have useful input. "He wants you to fail," she said, setting down her fork. "Not just lose the company, fail publicly, enough that nobody trusts you to run anything again. You've thought about this." "I read people," she said simply. "It's a skill you develop when you've had to." He looked at her for a long moment. "When you've had to what?" Her expression closed again, quick and practiced, but not before he saw something flicker behind it, something that looked almost like grief. "Survive," she said, and then, before he could follow that thread any further, she stood and carried her plate to the kitchen herself, ending the conversation the only way she seemed to know how, by physically removing herself from it. He sat alone at the table for a long time after that, turning the word over in his mind. Survive. Not a word people used casually, not a word that belonged to a woman who had grown up comfortable and untroubled. He thought again of the flinch at screeching tires, the gray hooded sweatshirt folded with too much care, the reflexes that moved faster than thought on a rain-slicked street corner, and he felt, for the first time, something less like curiosity and more like the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. The board meeting that Friday put a face to the pressure Ethan had only been reading about in reports. 12 directors sat around a long table, most of them people who had worked with his grandfather for decades, watching him with expressions that ranged from cautious support to open skepticism. The journalist's article about the marriage had circulated among them, printed and highlighted in places, and the chairman, a sharp-featured man named Colin Ashby who had never fully hidden his preference for Nolan, opened the meeting by reading a portion of it aloud. "A marriage of convenience," Colin read, his tone carrying just enough weight to make the words sound like an accusation rather than a quotation. "Arranged specifically to satisfy a legal technicality, raises reasonable questions about whether Ethan Cole possesses the judgment necessary to lead a company of this size." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet, when everyone is waiting to see who will speak first. "My grandfather wrote a condition into his will," Ethan said, standing rather than remaining seated, because he had learned long ago that certain conversations required you to meet them on your feet. "I met that condition. Whether the marriage began as convenience or something else entirely is, respectfully, no one's business but mine and my wife's. What should matter to this board is performance. Revenue is up 11% this quarter. 2 new contracts signed in the last 6 weeks alone. I'd invite anyone with genuine concerns about my judgment to look at the numbers before they look at the newspaper." Colin's expression did not soften, but several of the other directors exchanged glances that suggested the numbers had landed harder than the accusation. Marin, who had come to the meeting at Gareth's suggestion, sat quietly near the back of the room throughout the exchange, and it was only afterward, in the elevator down to the lobby, that Ethan realized how closely she had been watching Colin's reactions rather than his own. "He's not really worried about your judgment," she said once the elevator doors closed. "No," "He's worried about losing whatever arrangement he had with Nalan," she said. "People like that don't attack out of principle. They attack because something they were counting on is at risk. Watch who else in that room looked uncomfortable when the numbers came up. Those are the ones you can trust. The ones who only looked satisfied when the marriage was being criticized, those are worth watching more closely." Ethan looked at her, struck again by the particular precision of her read on people, a skill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple business instinct. "You'd have made a good board member yourself," he said. Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quickly to name before she answered. "I've had to read rooms my whole life," she said. "It's not a skill you learn by choice." He did not press her further that evening, though the comment stayed with him, another small piece added to a growing collection of things about his wife that did not yet form a complete picture, but that he was beginning slowly to want to understand. 2 nights later, the question sharpened into something closer to alarm. He was working late in his study when Ivy, his assistant, called with news that pulled him out of his chair. A routine inspection of the fleet had turned up something that should never have been routine at all. Someone had tampered with the maintenance records on one of the company's smaller cargo vessels, falsifying safety checks that had never actually been performed. If the ship had gone out as scheduled, with a faulty hull seal nobody had caught, 6 crew members would have been at sea in conditions the vessel was not equipped to survive. The inspection had caught it in time, barely. Ethan sat with the phone against his ear, feeling something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "Who signed off on the maintenance report?" he asked. Ivy's voice was careful. "Derek Voss. He's listed as a contractor, but the payment trail runs through an account connected to your cousin." Ethan closed his eyes. Nalan had not simply been trying to embarrass him. Nalan had been willing to risk 6 lives to make Ethan look incompetent, to prove to the board that he could not be trusted with the company his grandfather had built. He told Marin everything that night, sitting across from her in the dim light of the study, watching her face as the details unfolded. She did not look shocked. She looked focused, the way a person looks when a problem finally makes sense. "He'll do it again," she said. "Smaller this time, harder to trace. He's not trying to win an argument, Ethan. He's trying to win before anyone realizes there's a fight happening at all." "How do you know that?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time since the wedding, he thought she might actually answer a real question with a real answer. Instead, she said, "Because I've watched people like him before, people who smile in rooms and do damage in hallways." It was not an answer. It was the shape of one, offered from a safe distance, and he was too tired and too unsettled by the news about the ship to press her further that night. But he filed it away, the way he had filed away the flinch, the sweatshirt, the reflexes, the word survive, each piece small on its own. Together, they were starting to form the outline of a woman who had lived through something far larger than a business marriage, arranged to satisfy a dead man's will. He did not yet know what that something was. He was starting to understand that he wanted to. The week before the crash began with something small enough that neither of them thought much of it at the time, though later they would both return to it and wonder how they had missed the warning folded inside it. Ivy found the envelope taped to the underside of Ethan's car door handle on a Monday morning, plain white, no stamp, no return address, containing a single photograph of the house taken from across the street with a red circle drawn around the driveway in marker. No note, no explanation, just the photograph and the unmistakable message that someone had been standing close enough to their home to take it without triggering a single camera or alarm. Ethan reported it to building security, who reviewed the footage from the street cameras and found nothing useful, a gap in coverage that felt too convenient to be accidental. He mentioned it to Marin over breakfast the next morning, expecting her to share his unease. What he got instead was something closer to alarm dressed up as calm. "Have someone check the car," she said, setting down her coffee with more care than the gesture required. "Not just the outside, underneath, the engine, everything." "It's probably nothing," Ethan said. "Kids messing around, maybe. Or a photographer for one of the business papers trying to get a shot of the house." "Humor me," Maren said, and something in her tone, sharp and certain in a way he had rarely heard from her, made him agree before he had finished deciding too. The mechanic who checked the car that Tuesday found nothing out of place, which should have been reassuring and instead left Ethan with a low, persistent unease that followed him through the rest of the week. He caught himself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual. He noticed Maren doing the same from the passenger seat, her eyes flicking to the side mirror at intersections, her hand resting near the door handle in a way that looked, on reflection, like readiness rather than habit. On Thursday, walking home from a late meeting, Ethan was certain, for the space of 2 full blocks, that someone was following him. Footsteps matched his pace half a block behind, slowing when he slowed, and when he finally turned to look directly, there was no one there at all, only an empty street and a parked car with its engine still ticking as it cooled, as though it had only just been switched off. He told himself it was nerves. He told himself the envelope and the photograph had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, and that his mind was filling empty streets with threats that were not really there. He did not yet know that the mechanic who checked his car on Tuesday had been paid, quietly, the following day, to return to the garage after hours and undo the very inspection that had cleared the vehicle only hours earlier. He did not know that the brake line, intact on Tuesday afternoon, would not remain intact for long. The brakes failed on a Tuesday morning the following week, on the same stretch of coastal road Ethan had driven 1,000 times without thinking twice about it. He noticed the problem first as a softness under his foot, a delay between pressing and response that should not have been there. Then, cresting a hill at the exact wrong moment, he noticed it as something closer to panic, when the pedal sank all the way to the floor and gave him nothing back at all. The car did not slow. If anything, gravity took the hill and turned it into an accelerant, the speedometer climbing past numbers that had no business appearing on a road with curves this tight. Ethan's hands locked on the wheel. His mind, oddly calm in the way minds sometimes go calm when there is no time left for panic to be useful, ran through options with the flat efficiency of a checklist. Emergency brake. He pulled it. The car shuddered, fishtail, did not stop. Downshift. He tried, the gearbox grinding in protest, buying him perhaps 2 seconds of reduced speed before the next curve arrived faster than the car could handle it. He saw the guardrail before he felt the impact. White metal, silver in the morning light, and behind it nothing but a drop toward the water that he did not have time to measure before the car hit. The impact threw him sideways against the seatbelt hard enough to crack a rib. Metal screamed against metal. The windshield spidered into 1,000 small stars. The car came to rest at an angle, half over the guardrail, one wheel spinning uselessly in open air, and for a moment the world went entirely silent except for the sound of his own breathing, ragged and too fast, and against every reasonable expectation, still there. He was alive. Passers-by found him within minutes, pulled him free before the car's precarious balance could tip it the rest of the way over the edge. And the next clear memory he had was of hospital lights, the particular sterile brightness that seemed to erase everything softer than itself, and a nurse asking him to state his name for the 3rd time because the first 2 answers had not made sense. Maren arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, having driven through traffic with a speed that later made the housekeeper comment quietly that she had never seen anyone move so fast through a house to get out the door. She found him in a curtained bay with a cracked rib, a mild concussion, and a doctor named Owen Bates explaining with visible unease that the brake line had not simply failed. It had been cut, cleanly, in a way that suggested someone with mechanical knowledge had wanted it to look accidental. Ethan watched Maren's face when she heard that detail. Something in her went very still, the particular stillness of a person holding back a much larger reaction by force of will alone. She did not ask questions. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, took his hand without seeming to decide to do it, and stayed there while the doctors finished their examinations. "You should be resting," Ethan said. Once they were alone, his voice rough from the dryness of the oxygen mask he had worn on the way in. "I'm not the one who went off a road. You didn't have to come." "Yes," she said quietly, looking at their joined hands rather than at his face. "I did." He let that sit between them for a moment, unwilling to push at something that felt, for once, unguarded. Then, because the adrenaline was still leaving his system in slow, unpredictable waves, and because a hospital room at 2 in the morning has a way of loosening things that daylight usually keeps locked, he found himself talking. He told her about the crash from 11 years ago. He had never told the full story to anyone, not even the friends who had known him back then, not in the detail he gave it now, sitting in a hospital bed with a cracked rib and a wife who was technically a stranger, and somehow, in that moment, did not feel like one at all. He told her about the rain, and the swerve, and the sound the world made when it tilted sideways. He told her about waking to pain and to a girl's voice, steady in a way nothing else that night had been steady. He told her about the pressure of her hands against the wound in his side, holding him together, and the particular calm certainty in her tone that had kept him conscious long enough for help to arrive. "She left before the ambulance got there," he said. "I never saw her face clearly. Blood loss, probably. Or the rain. I asked everyone I could think of afterward. Nobody knew who she was. It's like she existed for exactly as long as I needed her to, and then she didn't exist anymore." Marin's hand, still holding his, had gone very still. "I think about her sometimes," Ethan admitted, staring at the ceiling because it was easier than looking at anyone while he said it. "I never got to thank her. I don't even know if she made it out of that night all right herself. She never said anything about being hurt, but there was blood on her that wasn't mine, or that's what one of the paramedics told me later. I've always wondered." The room was quiet except for the low hum of hospital machinery. Marin did not answer right away, and when Ethan finally glanced over at her, he found her looking at their hands, her expression unreadable in the dim light, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was holding something very carefully in place. "You don't have to say anything," he said, misreading her silence as discomfort. "I don't usually talk about it. I don't know why I'm telling you now." "I'm glad you did," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected, though something underneath it was not steady at all. "Everyone deserves to have their story heard by someone." She did not say more than that. She did not offer theories, or sympathy dressed up as curiosity, or any of the small, comforting nothings people usually offered when confronted with a story like his. She simply sat with him, her hand in his, until the sedative the nurse had given him finally pulled him under into a sleep too heavy for dreaming. He did not see her face in the moment just before he lost consciousness. If he had, he would have seen tears she did not let fall, and an expression that looked less like sympathy and more like a woman recognizing, finally and completely, a debt she had spent 11 years believing she would never have to answer for. The investigation into the brake line moved quickly once Ethan was discharged 2 days later, and it moved in a direction that surprised no one who had been paying attention. Gareth Finch, working with a private investigator, the company retained for exactly this kind of situation, traced the tampering back to a mechanic who had, until recently, worked at the garage that serviced Ethan's car. The mechanic, once questioned, admitted readily that he had been paid a significant sum by a man he could only describe vaguely, cash changing hands in a parking lot with no names exchanged. The payment trail, when the investigator finally pulled it apart, led to the same account that had funded the falsified maintenance reports on the cargo vessel weeks earlier. Nolan. Ethan sat in Gareth's office with the evidence spread across the desk, feeling something cold and clear settle into place where confusion had been before. His cousin was no longer simply trying to embarrass him in front of the board. His cousin had tried to kill him. On a road 11 years removed from the last time a car had nearly ended Ethan Cole's life, and the symmetry of it made his stomach turn in a way the physical injury never had. "We have enough to go to the police," Gareth said. "This isn't a business dispute anymore. This is attempted murder." "Do it," Ethan said, and there was no hesitation in his voice at all. The arrest happened 3 days later, quiet and fast, Nolan taken from his own front door in a manner that made the evening news despite the family's best efforts to keep it contained. The board, once the details became public, moved swiftly to affirm Ethan's position as head of the company, any lingering doubt about his readiness to lead erased by the simple, brutal fact that someone had tried to remove him from the equation entirely rather than beat him fairly. It should have felt like a victory. In many ways it did. The company was secure. His cousin's threat was neutralized. The 6-month deadline no longer mattered in the same urgent way, because the board's confidence in him had solidified into something that did not require a marriage certificate to sustain it. But Ethan found himself thinking less about the company in the days that followed, and more about the way Marin's hand had gone still in the hospital room, and the strange, careful catch in her voice when she said everyone deserves to have their story heard by someone. Something about that night sat wrong with him in a way he could not immediately name. It was not suspicion, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of standing in a room and knowing, without being able to say how, that a piece of furniture had been moved. He started paying closer attention. He noticed that Marin avoided the topic of that hospital conversation entirely in the days that followed, redirecting smoothly any time it drifted close, the way a skilled conversationalist redirects a subject without ever seeming to have changed it at all. He noticed that she had started watching him, too, in quiet, unguarded moments when she thought he was not looking, with an expression that held equal parts tenderness and something that looked almost like guilt. He noticed, one evening, that she had taken the gray hooded sweatshirt out of the back of her closet and moved it to a drawer closer to the front, as though she were preparing, slowly and without quite deciding to look at it more directly than she had allowed herself to in years. He did not understand yet what any of it meant. He only understood that his wife, the stranger he had married out of legal necessity, was carrying something heavy enough to change the shape of her face when certain words were said in her presence, and that whatever it was, it seemed to be connected, in some way he could not yet see, to the same rain-soaked night that had shaped the entire second half of his life. He decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that he was going to find out what it was. He did not know, as he made that decision, how close the answer already was. He did not know it lived in a storage unit 2 miles from the house, folded inside an old coat with a stain that had never fully washed out. He did not know that the woman who had saved his life 11 years ago had been sitting across the dinner table from him every night since the wedding. Watching him not recognize her, and carrying the weight of that silence the way some people carry grief, quietly and without complaint, because they have convinced themselves it is easier than the alternative. He only knew that something was buried beneath the surface of his marriage, and that, for the first time since he had signed a contract disguised as a wedding certificate, he wanted very badly to dig it up. The storage unit was not a secret, exactly, though Marin had never mentioned it either. Ethan found the key by accident, tucked into a small box on her dresser that he had been looking through only because he was searching for a spare set of house keys and had not expected to find anything else worth noticing. The key was old, attached to a paper tag with a unit number written in handwriting that was not hers, faded enough to suggest it had been sitting untouched for years before she ever came to own it. He should have left it alone. He told himself that several times over the following 2 days, and each time the thought did not stick. He went on a Saturday, while Marin was out meeting Claire Doyle, a friend she saw rarely enough that Ethan had only met her twice. He told himself he was simply curious about a storage unit his wife had never mentioned. He told himself this was not the same as searching for answers to a question he had not yet found the courage to ask directly. The facility was small, the kind of place with narrow hallways and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Unit 214 sat at the end of a row, its door sticking slightly when he lifted it, hinges protesting a lack of use that suggested Marin had not opened it in a long time. Inside there was less than he expected. A few boxes, unlabeled, an old bicycle with flat tires, a small trunk pushed into the corner, its latch closed but not locked. He opened the trunk before he let himself think too hard about whether he should. Inside, folded with a care that did not match the years of neglect surrounding it, was a coat. Dark fabric, long out of fashion, the kind of coat a young woman might have worn walking home on a cold night more than a decade earlier. The lining, when he lifted it toward the light, showed a stain gone rust brown with age, spread across the inner seam in a pattern that made his breath catch before his mind had fully caught up to why. Tucked into the pocket, folded into a small, careful square, was a hospital discharge slip. He read the date twice before his hands understood what his eyes already knew. It lined up, exactly, cruelly, completely, with the worst night of his life, 11 years and 2 months earlier. The name on the slip was smudged in one corner, water-damaged, but the first letter was still legible, and it was an M. He sat on the edge of the trunk for a long time, the coat in his lap, running his thumb over the stain the way you might touch a wound to see if it still hurts. He did not confront her that night. He told himself he needed time, though the truth was closer to fear, a reluctance to hear the answer spoken aloud when part of him had already accepted it was true. He sat with the coat, and with the discharge slip, and with 11 years of wondering about a girl who had vanished into the rain, and he let the pieces settle into a shape he had been circling without quite letting himself see for weeks. He waited 3 days. He waited because he wanted to be certain, and because some quiet, careful part of him understood that a truth this large deserved to be approached rather than ambushed. He gathered nothing further, asked no more questions, watched no more carefully than he already had. He simply waited until an evening when the house was quiet and the staff had gone home, and it was only the two of them at the long table where they had eaten 100 careful, distant dinners since the wedding. He set the coat on the table between them. Marin went very still. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and she set it down slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they are giving themselves time to think. "This was you," Ethan said. It was not a question. His voice came out quieter than he expected, stripped of the calm authority he usually carried into difficult conversations, replaced by something rawer. Marin did not deny it. She looked at the coat for a long moment, and then at him, and something in her face finally opened, the careful blankness she had worn for months giving way to an exhaustion that looked almost like relief. "Yes," she said simply. The word landed harder than a longer answer would have. Ethan sat back in his chair, the 11 years of unanswered questions rising in him all at once, tangled together with the months of careful marriage and the near misses, and the flinches at screeching tires that suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," she said. "At first I thought you'd remember on your own. When you didn't, I told myself it was better that way, easier for both of us." "Easier," he repeated. "You built a whole story around that night," she said, and her voice, though quiet, had an edge of something fierce underneath it. "A girl who saved you and vanished. It meant something to you, exactly the way it was. I didn't know if telling you the truth would give you an answer or just take something away." He wanted to be angry. He found, sitting there with the coat between them and 11 years of silence finally breaking, that what he felt was closer to grief, sharp and disorienting. For all the months they had spent as strangers when they had already, in the most important way, known each other since he was 19 years old. "Tell me," he said, "all of it, please." She told him in small pieces, the way a person hands over something fragile, one careful section at a time. She had been walking home that night, cutting along the coastal road because the bus had come late, and she had not wanted to wait another 20 minutes in the rain. She heard the crash before she saw it, the specific tearing sound of metal against metal that she said she still heard sometimes in quiet moments, years later. She had run toward it instead of away, because some instinct in her, some old habit from a childhood that had not always been safe, told her that seconds mattered and someone needed to be the person who did not hesitate. She found him bleeding, pinned partly by the wheel, conscious but fatting. She had done what she could with what she had, which was a coat and steady hands, and a voice she forced to stay calm even though everything in her had wanted to scream. She had stayed until she heard the sirens close enough to know help was coming, and then she had left. Before anyone arrived to ask her questions she could not afford to answer. "I didn't have anywhere to say I lived," she said, and the sentence came out flat practiced, the kind of sentence a person has said to themselves so many times that it has lost its sharpest edges. "I was staying somewhere that wouldn't have survived a hospital asking questions about a minor without a guardian present. I couldn't risk it. I told myself you'd be fine. I told myself the paramedics would take it from there. And they did, and I went home. And I never let myself think about it too hard again, because thinking about it too hard meant thinking about everything else that year, and I didn't have room for that." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had in the hospital room weeks earlier, except this time he understood exactly what he was holding. "You kept the coat," he said. "I couldn't throw it away," she admitted. "I told myself it was evidence, in case anyone ever came looking for the girl in the news reports. Nobody ever did. After a while I think I just kept it because it was the last proof that it happened, that I did something that mattered once even if no one ever knew." "I knew," he said. "I just didn't know it was you." She looked at him then, really looked, the guarded distance she had maintained since their first meeting finally, fully gone. "When you told me the story in the hospital," she said, "I almost told you everything right there. I didn't because you'd just been through another crash and I couldn't add this on top of it. I told myself I'd find the right moment. I don't think there ever would have been a right moment. I think I would have kept waiting forever if you hadn't found the coat yourself." Ethan sat with that for a long moment, turning over 11 years of wondering and months of careful, distant marriage and the strange, persistent feeling that had followed him since their wedding day, the stuttered grip, the déjà vu he had never been able to explain. "My hand," he said slowly. "At the wedding when we touched, I felt something, I couldn't explain it. It was like my body remembered something my mind hadn't caught up to yet." Marin's eyes filled, finally, with the tears she had been holding back since the hospital room, since the storage unit door had first creaked open in his memory of what must have happened, since the moment he set the coat on the table between them and ended 11 years of a secret she had carried entirely alone. "I felt it too," she said. "I've felt it every time you've touched my hand since the day we met at that restaurant. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining it because I already knew who you were and you didn't know who I was, and it felt unfair to let myself feel anything real about a marriage that was never supposed to be real in the first place." The house was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, rain had started to fall again, soft against the windows, nothing like the storm from 11 years earlier, but present enough that neither of them could fully ignore the echo. Ethan did not let go of her hand. "I don't think it's unreal anymore," he said. "I don't think it ever was." Marin did not answer with words. She simply turned her hand over in his, palm to palm, the way she had once held a wound closed on a rain-soaked road, except this time there was nothing broken to hold together. There was only two people, finally sitting in the same room without any distance left between them, beginning to understand what it might mean to build something real out of a story that had started 11 years ago, with a stranger's hands and a debt neither of them had known the other was still carrying. The trial moved faster than anyone expected, the evidence against Nolan too clean and too damning to allow for the kind of delays wealthy defendants usually manage to buy themselves. The falsified maintenance reports, the cut-break line, the payments traced through accounts Nolan had been careless enough to leave connected to his own name in at least 2 places. All of it built a case that left his lawyers with very little room to maneuver. Ethan sat in the courtroom on the first day of testimony with Maren beside him, her hand resting lightly over his on the polished wood of the bench, and found that the anger he had expected to feel toward his cousin had already burned down to something quieter and more tired. He did not need Nolan to suffer. He needed the company protected, and the people who worked for it kept safe. And he needed, more than either of those things, to walk out of the courthouse each day and go home to a wife who no longer felt like a stranger sharing his address. The one moment of real danger came on the 3rd day, when Derek Voss, the contractor who had carried out Nolan's instructions on the break line, decided that testifying against the man who had paid him was less appealing than eliminating the possibility of testimony altogether. He was arrested in the parking garage beneath the courthouse before he ever got close to the building, a knife found in his jacket that made the local news for exactly 1 evening before the story moved on to something else. Security around the trial doubled overnight. Ethan spent one long, sleepless evening standing at the window of the study, watching headlights pass on the street outside, until Maren came and stood beside him without a word and simply took his hand, the way she had a habit now of doing whenever fear needed somewhere quiet to go. "He can't reach us," she said. "Not anymore. Whatever this was building toward, it's already collapsed." "I know," Ethan said. "I still can't stop watching the street." "Then I'll watch it with you," she said, and they stood there together until the fear, unspoken and unresolved but no longer unbearable, finally loosened its grip enough to let them both sleep. Nolan was convicted on all counts 3 weeks later. The sentence was long enough that the board stopped whispering entirely about whether Ethan deserved his position, and long enough that the company's insurers, initially nervous about the scandal, quietly renewed every contract they had threatened to cancel. The shipping business that Walter Cole had built from a single leased vessel decades earlier continued forward, steadier now than it had been in years, no longer shadowed by a rival within the family who wanted to see it fail. But the part of the story that mattered most to Ethan had very little to do with courtrooms or contracts. In the weeks following Nolan's conviction, he and Maren began, slowly and without either of them announcing it as anything significant, to build a marriage out of the wreckage of the arrangement that had started it. The dinners grew longer. The silences grew warmer instead of colder, filled now with the kind of comfortable quiet that comes from 2 people who no longer need to fill every gap with careful conversation. Maren told him more about the years before they met, in pieces, the way she had told him about the coat, never all at once, always trusting him with a little more as the trust between them deepened. She told him about a childhood spent moving between homes that were never quite hers, about a mother who had struggled with things Maren did not fully explain and did not need to, about the particular resilience a person builds when they learn young that no one is coming to save them, so they had better learn to save themselves, and when the moment calls for it, save someone else too. She told him that the night of his accident had not been the only time she had run toward danger instead of away from it. It had simply been the night that mattered most, the one that had followed her for 11 years in the form of a coat she could not throw away, and a story she had never told anyone, not even Claire, who knew almost everything else about her. "Why me?" Ethan asked her one evening, months into the marriage that no longer felt anything like a contract. "Why did you agree to marry a stranger, knowing who I was, knowing what that night meant?" Maren considered the question for a long moment before answering. When the matchmaking service first mentioned your name, I almost said no, she admitted. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I thought about the fact that I'd spent 11 years wondering if you were all right, if you'd healed, if the person I pulled through that night had gone on to build a good life. And I realized I had a chance to actually know the answer instead of wondering forever. I told myself I'd help you save the company, and then quietly let the marriage end when the 6 months were up, and I'd never have to explain any of it. What changed? You did, she said simply. Or maybe I did. I'm not sure it matters which. I just know that somewhere between the wedding and the hospital and the coat, I stopped wanting an ending and started wanting whatever this was becoming instead. He reached across the space between them and pulled her closer, the gesture unremarkable in itself, ordinary in the way that only comes after months of learning someone's rhythms and preferences, but extraordinary in what it represented. Two people who had started as strangers bound by paperwork, ending up exactly where neither of them had expected but both of them, in the end, had wanted. On the 1-year anniversary of their wedding, Ethan arranged something he had never told her about in advance, a small gathering in the same garden behind Gareth Finch's office, where they had first exchanged vows neither of them believed in. This time, there was no lawyer reading conditions from a will, no contract disguised as romance. This time, it was simply the two of them, standing under the same arch, surrounded by a small handful of people who had come to matter to both of them over the past year, Claire Doyle among them. Along with the elderly man Marin had pulled to safety on that rain-slicked street corner, who had insisted, once he learned the date, that he would not miss it for anything. Ethan did not need a script this time. He looked at Marin, standing across from him in a dress simpler than her wedding gown but somehow more beautiful for its simplicity, and he spoke the words he had been carrying since the night she told him the truth about the coat. "I married you because a dead man's will told me I had to," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "I'm standing here now because I choose to. Every day since the day I understood who you were, I've chosen it again. I intend to keep choosing it for as long as you'll let me." Marin, who had faced down speeding cars and sabotaged brake lines, and a childhood that had given her every reason to expect the world would eventually let her down, found that her voice shook only slightly when she answered him. "You already saved yourself that night," she said. "I just helped. Everything since then, everything you've built. Every choice you've made to become the kind of man worth pulling out of a wreck, that part was always yours. I'm just grateful I got to watch you become him. And I'm grateful, more than I can say, that I finally got to stop carrying this alone." There was no dramatic rescue at the end of their story, no final threat to overcome, no last-minute crisis to survive together. There was only this: two people who had been bound first by duty and then, slowly and honestly, by choice, standing in a garden where rain had once threatened but never fell, promising each other a future neither of them had expected to find. The coat still hung in their closet, no longer hidden in a storage unit 2 miles away, no longer folded with the careful, guilty precision of a secret that could not be spoken. It hung instead as a reminder, worn openly now, of the night two strangers first became connected without either of them knowing it, and of everything that had grown, slowly and against every reasonable expectation, from a single act of courage on a rain-soaked road 11 years before the world finally brought them back together for good. Ethan Cole had married a woman out of duty, never knowing that she was the girl who had once knelt beside him in the rain and refused to let him go. By the time he learned the truth, duty had long since stopped being the reason he stayed. He stayed because somewhere between the wedding he never chose and the marriage he came to cherish, he had fallen completely and unmistakably in love with the same woman who had already, once before, saved his life. And this time, he intended to spend the rest of his own making sure she never had to save anyone alone again. In the 2nd year of their marriage, Marin came to Ethan with an idea she had clearly been turning over for a long time before she finally spoke it aloud. She wanted to start a program, funded through the company, that supported young people aging out of the foster system, the kind of program that would have changed the entire shape of her own life if it had existed when she needed it most. She wanted to fund transitional housing, job training, and a small emergency fund for exactly the kind of situation that had once left a 17-year-old girl unable to walk into a hospital and give her real name. Ethan did not hesitate. He had spent months watching Marin carry the weight of a past she rarely spoke about in detail, and he understood, without needing it explained further, that this was not simply a charitable idea. It was a way of turning something painful into something useful, of making sure that the particular kind of invisible desperation she had lived through would have one less foothold in someone else's life. They built the program together over the following months, Marin taking a role she had never expected to want, meeting with young people whose circumstances mirrored her own closely enough that she sometimes had to step out of the room to collect herself before continuing the conversation. She was good at it in a way that surprised even her, direct without being cold, warm without being naive, the product of someone who understood exactly what these young people needed to hear, because she had once needed to hear it herself and never had. Ethan watched her build something real out of the hardest parts of her history, and found that his admiration for her only deepened with every month that passed. The company that his grandfather had built out of a single leased ship became, under their combined direction, something that stood for more than quarterly earnings and shipping routes. It became a place with a foundation that quietly changed the trajectory of dozens of young lives every year, a legacy neither Walter Cole nor his strange, binding will could have predicted, but one that felt, somehow, exactly like the kind of thing the old man would have approved of. The elderly man Marin had pulled from the path of the speeding car became, unexpectedly, a fixture in their lives as well. His name was Bertram Cole, no relation despite the shared surname, a retired teacher who had lived alone since his wife passed and who found, in the aftermath of that near miss, an unexpected friendship with the couple who had become tangled up in his rescue. He came to dinner most weeks, told stories about decades spent teaching literature to bored teenagers, and became, in his own quiet way, something like the grandfather figure Ethan had lost and never quite finished grieving. There were harder days, too, because no marriage, however honestly built, exists without them. There were arguments about the company, about the foundation's growing demands on both their time, about the particular difficulty of learning to trust fully after each of them had spent years learning, for very different reasons, to trust carefully instead. Marin still flinched sometimes at sudden sounds, and some nights the old fear surfaced in ways that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with a nervous system that had learned, long ago, to expect the worst. Ethan learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to sit with her through those moments without trying to fix what could not be fixed quickly, offering instead the same steady presence she had once offered him on a rain-soaked road when steadiness was the only thing that mattered. He, too, carried scars that did not disappear simply because the story had found its resolution. He still avoided that particular stretch of coastal road when he could help it, still felt his pulse climb faster than it should whenever rain fell hard enough to blur the windshield. Marin learned to recognize those moments the way he had learned to recognize hers, and met them the same way, with patience instead of demands, presence instead of explanations neither of them fully had. On a rainy evening nearly 3 years after the wedding neither of them had wanted, Ethan came home to find Marin sitting by the window in the study, the gray hooded sweatshirt draped over the back of her chair, worn openly now rather than hidden, and a stack of paperwork spread across her lap that he recognized immediately as adoption inquiry forms from the Foundation's partner agencies. She looked up when he entered, and something in her face, open and hopeful in a way that still occasionally caught him off guard even after 3 years of learning her expressions, told him everything before she said a word. "I keep thinking about a kid who needs exactly what we could give them," she said. "Not because we owe anyone anything, just because we have it to give, and because I think I'd like to be the person for someone else that no one ever quite managed to be for me, back when I needed it most." Ethan crossed the room and sat beside her, taking one of the forms from her lap and reading it over, the two of them falling into the same quiet, companionable silence that had become the truest language of their marriage. "Then let's find them," he said simply. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady against the windows, no longer a sound that belonged only to grief and near disaster. It had become, over the years, simply weather, ordinary and unremarkable, the backdrop to an evening spent planning a future neither of them had once believed themselves capable of building. The story that had started with a stranger's hands pressed against a wound in the rain, and a marriage entered for reasons that had nothing to do with love, ended nowhere near an ending at all. It continued instead, quietly and steadily, the way the best true stories tend to, in small ordinary moments that mattered far more than the dramatic ones ever could. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, a hand reaching for another hand without needing to think about it first, a coat hanging openly in a closet as proof that some debts, once finally spoken aloud, transform into something far better than anything either of them could have repaid. Ethan Cole had been told once that duty was the only reason he needed to marry. He learned, in the years that followed, that duty had simply been the door. What waited on the other side of it, patient and unrecognized for far too long, had been love all along, carried quietly by a woman who had once saved his life, and then spent years learning how to let him save her back.